heard the term cherry picking? I used to pick cherries in the Okanagan region of British Columbia, and it can actually be a very fun activity. When you're picking cherries from a tree, you're only going after the ones that look the best. And that's kind of what cherry picking data is like. You are hoping, expecting, or just want a particular solution to a problem. So you only follow data that supports that predetermined conclusion and ignore anything that doesn't. Cherry picking has also been referred to as the fallacy of incomplete evidence or evidence suppression because it requires actively ignoring evidence that disproves an argument, point, or position. The main reason people cherry pick their data is to strengthen their own ideas, often with the knowledge that if they present other ideas, it might cause people to question them or make them look less credible. But when you cherry pick your data, your results are biased and you are prejudicing your conclusions. This could possibly cause misguided decision and policy making. Although this might be the goal of someone who is cherry picking their data purposefully, you can also cherry pick unintentionally with these consequences. Favoring information that supports prior beliefs sounds a lot like confirmation bias, doesn't it? That's because cherry picking and confirmation bias are related. Cherry picking is called a logical fallacy, while confirmation bias is a cognitive bias. On the Wichita State University website, they state that the distinction between a logical fallacy and a cognitive bias is that cognitive biases are rooted in the way the brain actually works, whereas logical fallacies are errors in argument. Learners can be trained to avoid logical fallacies, but cognitive biases are trickier. Let me give you a somewhat ridiculous example of cherry-picking information. However, it is only ridiculous because you know it to be factually inaccurate. Birds can't fly. Every continent on the planet is populated with species of birds that cannot fly. Bird species often evolve flightlessness because flight is a luxury that is not needed. Today, 60 species of flightless birds exist across 12 bird families. Sounds quite plausible when I put it that way, right? However, I took bits and pieces from an article and strategically omitted key information. What did the article actually say? Bird species often evolve flightlessness in environments with no predators because flight is a luxury that is not needed when there are no enemies to escape from. Taken in context, it is clear that only birds with no predators were likely to evolve flightlessness, but that's not what I presented. Today, 60 species of flightless birds exist across 12 bird families. While this is factually accurate, I carefully omitted the fact that a UNSW study found there were an estimated 9,700 different kinds of bird species, including flightless birds. Instead, I made it sound like there were only 60 species of birds in total. Although I did use the word flightless, I didn't mention flighted birds at all. Although I picked a fairly easy example here, here's another less apparent example. Inflation and the prime lending rate in Canada are the highest they've ever been. The inflation rate was 6.32% at the end of 2022, and the closest it has ever come to that in the last 40 years is 5.26% in 1989. Similarly, the prime lending rate was at 7.20% in January 2023. This is the highest it has been in the last 20 years. The closest we have ever come to that is 6.00% back in 2006 and 2007. Sounds pretty dire, right? And although this data is accurate, do you want to know why it is cherry-picked? Well, first, I limited inflation to only 40 years. If I had gone back 50 years, you would see that 9 of those 10 extra years would have had higher inflation, thus undermining my point. I also only limited the prime lending rate to the last 20 years, because if I went back 30 years, 3 of the extra 10 years would have had higher prime lending rates. And if I had gone back a full 50 years to be in line with my non-cherry-picked inflation, 22 of the last 50 years, or close to half, would have been higher than January 2023. Although the real story still isn't great, inflation and the prime lending rates are higher than they have been in quite a while, the cherry-pick story looks even worse. I also did 3 other things that added legitimacy to my cherry-pick data. I included 2 different data sets, inflation and the prime lending rate. More than one data set makes it look like you found corroborating evidence. I included some years where people are aware that things were not that great, namely the early 80s for inflation, although I didn't go back far enough. And third, I added 2 decimal points to my rates to show more detail. By not rounding the numbers, people are less likely to question the accuracy and validity of the information. So next time you read an article or see a graph, pause for a minute and think not only about what data has been included, but whether data has been excluded. If it's a topic you're really interested in, do more research and investigation beyond what was presented to get the full story and not just what was cherry-picked for you to read.